Hi everyone, and welcome to our video lecture for week 3 on knowledge, power, and ethics. Our first reading this week introduces the basic principles of research ethics. The author uses this diagram to illustrate the various normative commitments that we're obligated to respect. Each ring in this concentric circle of obligations is justified by a particular branch of normative ethics. For example, at the core of the diagram is egoism, or the principle that we ought to do what is in our own long-term best interest. This includes obvious things, like reporting misconduct and avoiding plagiarism, as well as more critical tasks, such as guarding against biases and demonstrating our reasoning. We also have obligations to our institutions and fields. For instance, you are all now representatives of Gratz College, and are becoming members of the diverse community of scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies. As such, you're obligated to promote these larger interests. And given the sensitive nature of our research, we must respect the rights of others, especially our research subjects and participants. Finally, we have larger social responsibilities, not just to all of humanity, but to all of creation. These ethical obligations are crucially important in our discipline, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is an especially sensitive area of research. This issue is covered in one of our recommended readings this week, seen here, which defines sensitive research as research which potentially poses a substantial threat to those that are or have been involved in it. The key concern here is threat, or something likely to cause pain, injury, or damage. There are multiple types of threat, all of which are implicated in our discipline. The dangers involved with intruding into issues that are private or stressful is especially relevant, as I'll elaborate momentarily with regards to trauma. The threat of sanction is important when dealing with perpetrator, bystander, or victim testimonies, for example. And the implications of getting involved in social conflicts is almost unavoidable in our discipline, which is inherently fraught with politics. But let me come back to the issue of intrusive threat, especially as it relates to the problem of trauma. Trauma is our normal means of relating present suffering to past violence. Obviously, trauma is unavoidable in Holocaust and genocide studies. This poses a challenge for us as outside observers. How do we represent the trauma of others? When our research enters the lives of others, we risk reinscribing, reestablishing, or reactivating traumatic experiences. This risk is apparent when we deal with human subjects or participants, whether deceased or alive. For example, one of our recommended readings this week is by cultural theorist Linda Chun, whose recent dissertation chapter opens with a reflection on the reoccurring psychosomatic trauma experienced by her mother, who survived the Cambodian genocide and immigrated to America. But this risk also works in a larger sociological sense as well. Indigenous feminist scholar Eve Tuck warns against what she calls damage-centered research, or research that intends to document people's pain and brokenness to hold those in power accountable for their oppression. In both cases, the danger is of focusing too much on pathology and deficits, rather than on survival and resilience. There are important protocols when doing sensitive research on human subjects or participants who are alive, particularly with the Institutional Review Board. This is a legacy of the Nuremberg trials, specifically the so-called Doctor's Trial, where medical doctors involved with Nazi human experimentation and the euthanasia campaign were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg Code was issued as part of the verdict, where the judges articulated a sophisticated set of 10 research principles centered not on the physician, but on the research subject. So, for example, the first principle is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Also, any experiment should be conducted so as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. During the course of the experiment, the research subject has the liberty to withdraw from the study if they fear possible harm. In the United States, the federal government established the Institutional Review Board system in order to streamline a variety of processes to ensure the protection of human subjects. That's the core purpose of the IRB, to protect human subjects. Obviously, this has greater relevance in the medical sciences, but it's still relevant to certain projects in the humanities and social sciences that involve collecting private information about individuals who are currently alive. Most colleges and universities have their own IRB. Here at Gratz, our IRB chair is Dr. Ruth Sandberg. Down the road, if you're planning on researching human subjects for your dissertation, for example, if you're going to be doing oral histories, you'll need to reach out to her and read the IRB handbook, which is available under this week's recommended readings. Even if you're not going to be quote-unquote using live human subjects, and I'll come back later to the problematic issue of quote-unquote using research subjects, your research still isn't free of ethical concerns. Although there are no analogous protocols like the IRB, there are important ethical considerations when it comes to archival materials. For example, there are issues of consent involved with archives' original intake procedures. In most present-day archival institutions, there are specific procedures where the creators of materials or their heirs sign deeds of gift giving permission for their work to be in the archive. But these processes were not common 50, 100, 200 years ago or more, and are still often not processes followed by private institutions. The situation is even more complicated when considering the lives and experiences of vulnerable populations, whose materials may end up in archives without them even knowing about it. Quite simply, if consent is absent, then we may be implicated in exploiting human subjects. There's also issues about what's public and what's private. How do we balance society's presumed right to knowledge with the individual right to privacy? This concern is especially perplexing when the issue of consent is unclear. Are there circumstances in which archival material should not be used? And more generally, what are the rights of the deceased? According to the law, the dead retain rights to bodily privacy to protect them against desecration. But how far are we willing to extend rights to the deceased, especially in cases where their consent was lacking, or where their materials posed the threat of sanction? Are we responsible for protecting the rights of the deceased? There are other ethical considerations with archives as well, particularly as they operate as institutions of power. Indeed, the word archive is etymologically related to words like monarch or oligarch, connoting a sense of power, rule, and authority. Archival institutions decide on what they will archive and what they allow researchers to see. They cannot be considered neutral institutions. Rather, the process of storing, organizing, and dispensing documents is inherently political and power-laden. For example, you see here an image from the Vatican's secret archive. Pope Francis decided to selectively open up portions of the archive related to Holocaust-era documentation, but even so, only with restrictions and under strict control. Ethical considerations extend beyond human subjects and archives. For example, our second required reading this week was based on a research project concerning the representations of women in the memorial culture of Holocaust monuments and museums. The author raises some common ethical concerns that many of you will face as researchers. For example, she speaks of her conflicting roles as an ethnographic researcher on the one hand, who has been professionally socialized to maintain a certain degree of distance in the process of objectifying data collection, and as a Jewish woman on the other hand, who has an intimate and personal connection to the process of subjective witnessing. We'll return to this dilemma in the next slide. But the author also faced a dilemma in the process of privileging a certain type of data collection. Naturally, given the nature of her research project, she was committed to privileging the representation of women in Holocaust memorials. But in the process, she was necessarily excluding other types of data, and as a result, the representation of children and men receded into the ethnographic background. This problem is unavoidable. The selection of certain types of data necessarily involves the omission of others. But notice my use of the word data just now. Recall as well my comment in the previous slide about the problems of quote-unquote using human subjects. This points to a third ethical dilemma, which is the objectification of our research subjects. That is, of degrading people, whether dead or alive, into mere objects that can be used at our disposal. There are no easy answers to these dilemmas, but a feminist research ethic, I think, can help us find a balance. Quick note of clarification. I'm advocating here for a feminist research ethic. That doesn't necessarily entail a commitment to feminism per se, which is a normative commitment against sexism and patriarchy, nor am I saying that you should have a feminist research agenda. Rather, I'm suggesting that we can benefit from following a feminist research ethic as a methodological commitment to certain principles. Here are 4 core principles of the feminist research ethic. First, it requires an attentiveness to power, particularly the way in which those with the power to say what is quote-unquote true have so much power we don't even see them exercise it unless we look for it. Secondly, it requires an attention to boundaries, and the ways in which we construct them all the time in order to simplify the world we see and are trying to understand. As noted, the construction of boundaries necessarily involves the potential for exclusion and marginalization. Moreover, gestures towards inclusion may be incomplete or superficial. Third, we must remain aware of our relationships, not just between the researcher and the research subject, but also between the research subject and her or his communities, not to mention between the researcher and her or his audiences. Finally, and most importantly, is the practice of self-reflexivity, of always being willing to revisit our prior reflections on power, boundaries, and relationships, and always remembering to redirect our critical reflection on others' choices back at our own choices, and approaching the responsibilities of ethical scholarship with humility. This latter principle of feminist research ethics challenges a long-standing taboo against the presence of emotions in research. Positivism was once the dominant paradigm in the social sciences. We'll discuss this further next week, but basically positivism applies the principles of the scientific method to the study of society. As such, it's based on the premise that scientific inquiry commences with quote-unquote neutral observation by disinterested researchers. Yet, in order to understand the experiences and realities of another, the researcher needs to acknowledge their own subjectivities, for example, their own values, beliefs, and emotions, and how they are involved in the research process. That means that we're never neutral, disinterested researchers. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater either, as there's a delicate balance to be found. On the one hand, as genocide scholars, we may, indeed should, invest in a strong sense of empathy, of feeling another's emotions oneself as an emotional resonance, rather than just correctly acknowledging them. At the same time, we may exercise what healthcare workers call clinical detachment, a conscious choice to numb ourselves to the emotional resonance with others, not just to uphold some pretense of objectivity, but also to help us cope with the endemic trauma that's inherent to our discipline. Look at this quote highlighted here by Saul Friedlander, who speaks of finding a balance between the emotional impact and the protective numbing of studying the Holocaust. In other words, the ideal response is to strike a balance between empathy and detachment. This is not an easy balance to strike, however, on the emotional challenges of genocide pedagogy. In particular, the author notes 3 related issues that are probably just as relevant to genocide research as they are to teaching. The first is burnout, or the emotional exhaustion caused by an empathetic overinvestment. Related to this is the notion of compassion fatigue, where prolonged exposure to the sufferings of others can leave us desensitized, indifferent, and with a generally diminished ability to empathize. Finally, there's the challenge of vicarious traumatization, which refers to the emotional residue of exposure to engagement with bearing witness to the traumatic stories of others. We should consider these to be occupational hazards of our discipline. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Please note that your assignment is part 2 of the source analysis project. I'd like you to use the same dissertation you worked with last week, but if for some reason you want to change it up, please contact me. I can work with you. Your assignment this week is to continue reading the body chapters and write another brief analysis in the form of a paragraph, at least. If you want or need to write more, by all means. But the goal this week is to focus on significance. Why is this research important? Does it pass the so what test? And does the dissertation address the ethical implications of research? Also, don't forget that you have a research proposal due at the end of the semester, so if you haven't started already, now's the time to do so. Please reach out to me if you want to discuss. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.